This is the Before You Read lecture on the plagues and the Passover, which covers Exodus chapters 7 through 13:10, Numbers 7, and Deuteronomy 16. With this lecture, we are starting a new format for these lectures in our class together. As mentioned earlier, we will be taking more of a thematic approach to the remainder of the Pentateuch. We will try to follow some of the major themes or major stages in this story of Israel's redemption from slavery in Egypt to their eventual entrance into Canaan, the Promised Land. This lecture and the readings of the Bible related to it represent the first stage of that story, the contest between Pharaoh and Yahweh, the God of Israel, to free the Israelites from bondage. You probably have some recollection of the plagues that are described in the book of Exodus. Maybe you remember the multitude of frogs, or the locusts, or maybe the rivers of blood, or the thunder and lightning, or the deep darkness over all of the land. My guess is that you remember at least part of this story, but I would bet that there are a variety of reactions to this part of the story, to these powerful and even frightening acts of God that will eventually lead to the people of Israel's freedom. Maybe these acts cause you to ponder the power of God, or you may wonder about the Egyptians who suffered and died because of the hard-heartedness of the Pharaoh. And maybe you're feeling more than one thing at once. That's okay. So how can we engage this part of the story effectively? The first point to make is that although it is common to refer to these acts as the plagues, the original Hebrew refers to them as signs or portents. That is, the acts themselves point beyond themselves. They are signposts for deeper realities. They thus have a symbolic function. So what do they point to? As biblical scholars have pointed out, they are bi-directional signs. They point back to the wickedness of Pharaoh's deeds, and they point forward to the final act of God's redemption, the Israelites' crossing of the Red Sea. To understand the plagues as signs and exactly what it is they are signaling, we must understand a basic assumption at work in the ancient Near Eastern world. And that assumption is that the just ordering of society through just laws brings about or maintains the creation of the world itself. On the other hand, unjust laws or breaches in justice bring about a breach in the created order. In this perspective, the actions of Pharaoh detailed in the first chapters of Exodus do not just oppress and oppose the people of Israel. More fundamentally, they are anti-life and anti-creation. They are, in other words, opposed to God's purposes for the created order. Pharaoh's genocidal actions to kill the male children of Israel moves against God's creational promises of fruitfulness that have begun to come to fruition and in fulfillment in and through the Israelites' growth. Thus, Pharaoh and Egypt become the embodiment of chaos. They work against God's ordering and creating purposes. As such, Pharaoh's actions threaten to return the entire cosmos to a pre-creation state. Seen in this life, the plagues are not just impressive or even terrifying acts of God's power. They are rather the effect of Pharaoh's anti-creational sins, and they render God's judgment on Pharaoh's attempt to undo creation and bring about chaos. In this way, the contest between Pharaoh and the God of Israel recalls ancient Near Eastern myths of the battle between the forces of order and the forces of chaos. The contest becomes a cosmic battle in the truest sense of the word. As one Old Testament scholar puts it, the consequences are cosmic because the sins are creational. God thereby acts to re-establish the rightness of the created order. Seen in this light, the 10 acts reflect God's attempt to recreate the world, to restore order, to resist chaos, and to fulfill God's original mission in creation, which was to create a world teeming and bursting with life. Ultimately, the 10 acts amount to new creation for the people of Israel, for Egypt, and for the whole created order. I think this is a compelling way to think about these 10 acts of God, and I am sure that it will generate some important questions and discussion. The final act of God, the final plague, the final sign, is the death of the firstborn Egyptians. It receives the longest description, most developed description in the book of Exodus. And it is also recalled in the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy as well. Part of the length afforded to this act is due to its connection to that Jewish religious festival known as Passover. Scholars believe that the Passover festival, or the ritual that it reflects, is actually the combination of two earlier festivals that were originally separate. Originally, there was a ritual associated with Passover, the idea that the angel of God passed over the households of Israel and instead killed the firstborn of Egypt. And then the second is the festival associated with unleavened bread. In Exodus 12 and 13, we see traces of these two festivals, but we see that they're combined into a single account related to Israel's redemption from Egypt. One of the important details in this part of the story is the significance of the lamb and the blood put on the doorposts of the Israelites' homes. Essentially, the blood of the lamb serves as a protective offering, ensuring that the Israelites are protected from the forces that will kill all of the firstborn among the Egyptians. So as you read this material in Exodus 12 through 13, take notice of the mention of children and of the questions that they are supposed to ask. The questions take on the feel almost of catechesis, of explaining to future generations what they believe about God's actions in the past and why they believe them. The Passover remembers and celebrates God's work to free the Israelites from their slavery in Egypt. I imagine that the plagues and the Passover will generate a variety of questions as you read. Pay attention to those questions. Make use of the study notes in your study Bibles and write down your reactions and your questions. These are important parts of engaging the Bible. Also, you may want to pay attention to the relationship between God and Pharaoh in this section. How is the contest between the two unfolding? What do you make of Pharaoh's hard-heartedness? Is it a result of Pharaoh's decision or of God's intention? Or is it a balance of the two? And what do you make of the Egyptians, the Egyptian people who really are sort of put out on the line because of the actions of the Pharaoh? Lots to chew on, lots to engage. Now get reading.